Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the Merryn Talks Money Market Wrap, where we talk about the biggest moves in market this week and what is driving them. I'm Merryn Somerset Webb, editor at large for Bloomberg UK Wealth.
And I'm John Stepek, senior reporter for Bloomberg and author of the Money Distilled newsletter.
Morning, John.
Morning, Merryn.
So today, I think we really have to talk about debt and we have to talk about tax. I mean, this week has been, I suppose you could say every week for quite a long time has been kind of the same, but this has been one of the weeks when the problems globally with public levels of debt has come right to the fore again. And that has particularly been the case in the UK, where we've had this report out from the OBR saying that things are really very, very, very bad. So we've got tax burden at a 75-year high, but yet our finances are described as vulnerable, daunting, growing pressures, unsustainable position in the long term, and the UK cannot afford the array of promises that it has made to the public. Now, you and I have talked a lot about this in the past, saying that one of the ways you grow out of debt is to default on your promises to the public, and that's just one of many things that's going to happen. But we are also beginning to see the impact of all this concern about UK levels of unsustainable debt. We're beginning to see that in the debt markets themselves, right?
Yeah, I think so. And it is something that we've talked about a lot. But I mean, even the OBR points out that the UK, in terms of its borrowing costs, is higher than almost any sort of peer economy. I think the only ones that are, let me just check this report, but I think the only ones that are doing worse from that point of view is UK government debt is fourth highest among advanced European economies, sixth highest among advanced economies after Japan, Greece, Italy, France and the US. But we also face the third highest borrowing cost of any advanced economy after New Zealand and Iceland. And you know, I mean, New Zealand and Iceland aren't exactly major economies.
No. So just to put it in perspective, our 30-year yield is now what, 5.45%, 5.44, something like that. And the 10-year yield at 4.6-ish. So these are very high borrowing costs for the UK.
Yeah, and the problem is that it's happening at a time where we've also got very high debt. So we're paying a very high interest rate on a massive pile of debt. To my mind, I think the thing that the OBR is pointing out is that this is not, our trajectory isn't sustainable. And one of the kind of like key charts in this OBR report is one where they point out that every single time there's a budget, the government promises, whichever government, obviously not just this government, promises that the trajectory is going to improve, that we're going to cut down on our deficit, and the actual outturn is that it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And we seem absolutely incapable, as discussed previously, and everyone has seen over the last couple of weeks, incapable of cutting spending. We cannot do anything about our insane welfare bill. We cannot do, even a tiny little chip around the edge, it just fails. The expectations of the population are constantly ratcheting up, and there doesn't seem to be a way out. I think trying to get to the heart of why that is interesting. I mean, it is difficult to take stuff away from people, but I do think that there's a sense I think almost everyone feels that there's someone else that is getting something they are not entitled to, or that there's someone else who is not being taxed heavily enough. And so this is one of the reasons why if you target anything at all, there's this sort of big backlash. But they also don't do it very well. I mean, the winter fuel allowance is a very good case in point. There were many ways you could have done that, and they chose basically the worst way to do it. So there's an element of being bad at politics involved here.
That's true. I mean, the winter fuel payment always seems to me that it should be part of a different part of the benefit system, or if you think people should have extra pension, which is effectively what it was, put it on the pension. And if it's not effectively extra pension, what is it for in the first place? I mean, all this stuff, you can pick any part of the welfare system and talk about how ridiculous it is. And one of the things that you and I were talking about briefly the other day was the extraordinary fact that you can claim an awful lot of benefits in the UK while still living in a house that you own outright. You can live in a £2 million house in London and still claim universal benefit. For example, this is one of the many madnesses inside a system that is now so complicated and so full of entitlement that it's practically impossible to clean up, so that the genuinely needy are the ones in receipt. Let's not go down any welfare rabbit holes. I could do it, but let's not.
But I think, again, there is that element of special interest groups, though, because we've always protected or viewed the house as some sort of advantaged asset in this country. And so I think that, it just speaks to the wider thing of that we now have so many third rails that there is nothing you can do.
Yeah, and there is no sense from politicians that you can come out and say, well, actually, every time you try and change anything, everyone says, well, you don't care about the poor or you don't care about the disabled. And the message needs to change to, if you really want to protect the poor and the disabled long term, then you need massive reform, or in the end, no one gets protected.
Absolutely. And I guess this is what markets are for, isn't it?
This is what markets are for, and markets are giving... giving that message very, very strongly to the UK, very strongly. So the solution, obviously the solution is to massively reform everything in sight quickly. That's not going to happen. So what's actually going to happen is the tax burden is going to rise from its current 75-year high. And the talk at the moment is around a wealth tax. Should there be a wealth tax in the UK? Now, you and I, we've talked about this so much, and the answer is no, of course not. Everywhere there is a wealth tax, it failed. This will be a disaster, and anyone who thinks that it's fine, it's all right, it's not me, it's the other rich people. Let us introduce you to fiscal drag.
Wealth tax is one of those things like rent controls, where you almost... It's almost not worth engaging in the argument, because if someone still believes it works by now, then they aren't amenable to reasonable conversation about it. They just want to believe that a wealth tax will solve things. They just want to believe that rent controls will solve things. So there's nothing you can say to change their minds.
Even though you've got, hundreds of years of history to show it isn't true. However, regardless of what you and I think about this, there are going to be more taxes on wealth. And it may be that this is not what we might call an official wealth tax, but one thing that we know, you and I, is that there are already a lot of wealth taxes in the UK. And the most likely thing we'll see from here is an increase in some of the wealth taxes that we already have. And I'm sure there are conversations going on around increasing capital gains tax. There'll be conversations around IHT. And I was looking at a note from RSM today, and there are horrifying suggestions in here, John. One of which is that they might look at the resident nil rate ban for IHT. So that idea that you can pass on an additional amount of money attached somehow to your main home. And this is always a bit of a fiddle, a complete fiddle, free of IHT. And the suggestion is that might be removed such that you only have your nil rate band of £325,000 per head to pass on, as opposed to the extra, £175,000 per head for this mythical family house. And that would bring an awful lot of new people into the IHT bracket, which is unpleasant. And the other really nasty possibility might be the removal of this idea that all your assets are rebased for capital gains purposes on death. So when you die, your estate is not liable for capital gains tax. It is only liable for IHT. And obviously that creates all sorts of complicated tax planning things for all sorts of people, and they don't like to sell and pay capital gains tax when they're old, because then they'd be double taxed effectively, or 500 times taxed given the way that the UK system works. And the removal of that would mean that on death, you would pay both capital gains and then IHT. So for example, let's say you inherited £100,000, which had capital gains tax. The net value had gone up. You would then pay your capital gains tax, and having paid that, you would then pay IHT on the remainder.
I can see that happening. The nil rate band for houses, I think, well, put it this way, if they're worried about political backlash, that would be like the winter fuel allowance, kind of like times 100. But the CGT thing, I think that would go over most people's heads.
yet. Well, until they had to pay it. So look at it like this. Let's say
exactly.
you had...
do you know what I mean? That's a long way down the line for lots of the people who might complain about it.
But it would also mean that, people who inherited relatively small amounts, or what we might think of as relatively small amounts in terms of IHT or in terms of inheriting housing, etc. Say you inherited something worth only £100,000, or you had a capital gain of £100,000, right?
Yeah.
And then you pay £24,000 in CGT. Then you would pay £30,400 in IHT on the remainder. So the overall tax rate on that bit of inheritance is 54%.
Yeah, I mean...
And even if you weren't liable for IHT, maybe you thought you were inheriting this thing and, you don't consider yourself to be the kind of person liable for tax on an inheritance, and you would still pay your £24,000. I mean, I think it would cause a bit of an uproar, but nonetheless, that is a wealth tax. It's a new wealth tax.
Do they have any idea or any estimate how much that would raise? Because the thing that gets me about all of this is that in terms of the gap between what we need realistically and what we get from all of these wealth taxes is big. And if you've ruled out touching things like income tax and VAT, it's very, very hard to fill.
Absolutely. This is fiddling around the edges. It is absolutely fiddling around the edges. But, it's performative wealth tax, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, again, Lo, that brings us back to the whole point about the markets, because I think one of the issues with the markets that possibly that goes a little bit under discussed is that it's not about the absolute numbers, it's about the sense that you're not getting a grip. It's, you can run a big deficit if people think that you're actually doing something with it. But at the moment, and for a long time now, it feels as if Britain's just sort of spiralling round the plug hole. And as you say, sort of targeting bits and pieces that are actually getting in the way and making everything harder and just clogging up the kind of economy's arteries more and more. Basically, if they tried to simplify things and it looked as if we were going to get some sort of plan in place that would actually work to get the economy growing and all the rest of it, then I think that the markets would give more leeway. Basically it's a governance issue. It's not a financial, well, it is a financial issue, but it's a governance issue first and foremost.
Although, reminder, John, that you can't plan growth and you can't create growth. You need to get out of the way and let growth happen.
Yeah, but that's they're not getting out of the way. That's the problem.
I mean, I think you and I both know, and all our listeners will also know, that this isn't impossible. That pretty much everything, not everything, but pretty much everything that is wrong with the UK can be fixed with major policy change. And those major policy changes aren't complicated until you start trying to implement them in a political environment, right? And the simplest way forward from here is to increase the rate of income tax for everybody. At the moment, what is the number? 55% of UK households are net receivers as opposed to net contributors to the system. That's not sustainable. This idea that you constantly take more and more and more people out of tax by keeping this historical thing we've had of raising the basic allowance for income tax to try and make sure that people don't pay tax was possibly the wrong approach. In the end, everybody has to contribute if you want to have a state of this size and if you want to continue to offer all these things. If you don't want that, then you have to find a way to cut spending. So really, it's not complicated on the face of it. It's only complicated inside the political environment that we have created for ourselves with a little political will. And, one had thought, I think you and I had thought, that a government with a vast majority like this might have the ability to make the changes that were necessary. But clearly it does not. So here we go, down the plug hole, John.
Well,
it's all over. The end of Britain.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember that one.
Yeah. You can look forward to a sharp rise in non-income taxes from here, followed by a sharp rise in the gilt yield, and followed by things that I don't really want to think about. But certainly a defaulting of the state's promises to its population. Have you got anything cheery to add, John, before I sign off? Because I really, really appreciate it if you did.
I don't really. Although, what's really interesting? I read something on Bloomberg this morning saying that Tether, the stable coin issuer, they have got a stash of $8 billion worth of gold So maybe finding a private central bank is what we all need to do.
That's so interesting. Even crypto moves to gold in the end. When I was tweeting about the UK's levels of debt this morning, pretty much everyone replied to me saying, got Bitcoin, to which my response was, no, but I have got gold.
I'm going to steal that one.
You are, aren't you? You haven't got any crypto, though. At least I've got some. No, none. Thanks for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Money debrief. If you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also be sure to follow me and John on X or Twitter at MerrynSW and John_Stepek. This episode was produced by Summer Sadi, production support and sound design by Moses, and questions and comments on the show and all our shows are always welcome. Our show email is merrynmoney@bloomberg.net.